Hello and welcome back to the KCC channel. I'm Rob and I hope you are having a wonderful day today. Today, we're jumping into some stories about Kevin. Before we start, if you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button. It's completely free and you can always change your mind later. But if you stick around, there might just be some tasty cookies in your near future, if you can pry them away from the chameleon. This story comes to us from Hazelaf, Kevin and the Dancing Dust. Let's jump right in. I'm gonna tell y'all a stupid story, and I'm gonna tell it just the way I remember it. Yes, it's about Kevin, but I'm not going to spare myself here either. I used to be a dumb butt too. I don't have much of a defense, except that I'm from Florida, and this took place there. Maybe that's all the defense I need, I don't know. This story happened during and because of my employment at a Radio Shack. If you didn't already know, Radio Shack workers used to be absolute effing party animals back in the day. I tell you this because no one out there seems to understand just how hard a nerd can go, and because it's germane to the story. So yeah, I was working at a Radio Shack in South Florida, and we'd just completed our inventory. Anyone who has worked in retail knows just how awful and tedious and freakishly time-consuming an inventory can be. Since this happened back in the 1990s, before QR codes and phasers came about, we had to find, count, and record each resistor, transformer, and capacitor, every effing item in the whole store by hand, with nothing but pen and paper. And boy did Radio Shack have a lot of little parts. It was mind-numbingly dull, and the process took several days to complete. This was also back when the movie Titanic came out, and the company had some kind of eldritch corporate partnership, which required us to play that abominable song on repeat all darn day. You know the one, don't make me say it. Naturally, out of self-preservation and sheer desperation, many of us employees resorted to unholy amounts of illicit substances and alcohol. Okay, I need to pause the story for a second so I can ask you guys a question. Have you ever had someone sidle up to you, like actually crab walk sideways, and then kind of slide the last 2 steps up to you? Well, if you haven't, let me tell you that it's just as weird and off-putting as you're imagining. I bring this up only because that's the thing I think about whenever someone mentions Kevin. For story purposes, you guys should know something about Kevin. I don't have enough characters in this subreddit to do his existence justice, so I will just give you a basic synopsis. This guy was something else. I'll qualify that statement by saying that he once got stranded for 4 years in Brazil after a falling out with his prison pen pal girlfriend. And before you ask why a Brazilian would write to an American inmate, I'll explain that he wasn't the ex-con. She was. He found her through the back pages of some magazine. The story of how Kevin learned about long-distance telephone charges goes here, but I'll save that tale for another time. When this girl finally kicked him out of her house, something to do with identity theft, smuggling, and exotic parrots, Kevin attempted to force the American government to send his broke butt back to the United States by literally lying on the street outside the embassy and wailing like a banshee on bath salts. As you can see, Kevin wasn't the sharpest of tacks. Sorry for the interruption, but I needed to make sure you guys understood a little something about Kevin before I continued telling this tale. So back to the story, it was around 10 p.m. and we'd just finished reconciling the inventory counts for the last time. Done. Finally. While it did turn out to be an excellent inventory, it was particularly long and grueling, and we were all exhausted and hangry by the end of it. My boss, being awesome, decided to celebrate by picking up a bunch of beer and pizzas and inviting us all back to his house. This is technically where the actual story starts, because this is when Kevin sidled up to me in the parking lot and asked me if I wanted to go with him real quick to pick up a bag of dancing dust. I guess I'm not the sharpest of tacks either, because I agreed to go. I had a car, but Kevin insisted on driving. This was a problem because Kevin drove a busted butt 1976 Lincoln Continental. It was probably a beautiful example of American automotive engineering in its day, with an original deep dark green paint job and flippy headlights, but now it was decrepit. The seats were sticky where they weren't threadbare, and the exterior was a veritable museum of failed cosmetic repairs. This thing was covered in primer, missing all but one of its hubcaps, and the glove box oozed some vile amalgamation of spilled coffee and shea butter, because, you see, Kevin had a skin condition. The car smelled just awful, like a dead squirrel filled with old Arby's and whipped cream and then left to rot in the tropical sun. If I'm being honest here, I rather appreciated the shea butter and coffee. In that car, the ooze was a feature. Standing there in the pale, washed-out light of the Radio Shack sign, I weighed my options and made my decision. I laid an old hoodie strategically over the passenger seat and climbed in. After all, free illicit substances was always worth a bit of hardship, right? Wrong. After a surprisingly uneventful drive, we got to his friend's place. He went inside, and when he came out, he was bouncing and armed with a huge 8-ball. His guy really did him right. The very sight of this thing made me super excited to get back to my boss's house so we could get down to some serious hoovering. Kevin put the car in gear and began to talk. I was ignoring this as irrelevant, absorbed in my own thoughts, when all of a sudden, Kevin hit a trash can. Because I wasn't sure if the hit was intentional, I glanced over. Uh-oh, Kevin was bent over, sweating and bug-eyed, fidgeting with the radio and simultaneously glancing back and forth between the rearview mirror and the side mirrors. Worried, I sat in watchful silence as he navigated his way out of the neighborhood. His conversation never faltered, even when we dinged a mailbox. Damn. With a sinking feeling, I realized that his gills were way past geeked. It was now around 11:30 and traffic had begun thinning out. His driving had deteriorated exponentially since leaving his friend's place, and I was only just then coming to terms with the fact that the reward, fat though it was, might not be worth the imminent disaster I could now see barreling down upon me. I knew then that this night was going to end badly. Something was going to happen. Something bad. My mind raced. Crap, we've got illicit substances. Kevin is driving this car. F. The vehicle is obviously held together by a combination of prayer, spray foam, and Bondo. Also, he's got no registration and an expired license. I know all this because Kevin told me after we left with the dancing dust. Kevin told me a lot of things during that drive. He answered a lot of questions about himself that I never asked. In fact, Kevin was so deep in dancing dust conversation that he missed a critical turn on the main highway. Upon realizing that he missed this turn, he waited for the next intersection, and against my desperate protestations, immediately cut across 3 lanes of traffic and slung that huge boat of a car around in a U-turn. While rather graceful, the move was illegal, and there was an unmarked police car behind us. Oh, I freaked out. Then, when the cop lit up his lights, I freaked out again, this time out loud. "You effing moron," I yelled. Kevin pulled over, except Kevin didn't pull over to his right like normal people do. No, he pulled over to his left, into a turn lane. The cop pulled up behind us and waited, probably confused. I think it was this confusion that saved me. I say me instead of we, because at this moment, Kevin decided that he had it all under control. If I remember the sequence of events correctly, and I will never forget what I witnessed in those few moments, Kevin winked at me and then proceeded to pull the dancing dust bag out of his pocket and empty it into his mouth. Then he started chewing. I should tell you that this was a solid 3.7-ish grams of yellow flake dancing dust, hard as a rock and uncut. It was huge. I sat awed and mesmerized at the scene unfolding before me. The red and blue lights flashing into the interior of the car made the whole thing even more surreal. All I could think was, oh my god, he's eating it. He's eating it. He's eating a whole 8-ball of dancing dust. Wait, he's the driver. Instantly frightened and struggling to overpower the creeping sense of horror shivering up my spine, I screamed at him. Something along the lines of, "What the F? What are you doing, you effing idiot?" And that's the exact moment when Kevin realized that he had royally effed up. Generally, when one gets pulled over by the police, they expect a coherent response, even in South Florida. He flung the car door open and dashed into the night. I can only imagine the consternation of the police officer behind us as Kevin abandoned his car and bounded away into a neighborhood. I sat frozen in the passenger seat, amazed and stunned, as the cop car behind me disengaged and took off down the side street after him. To this day, I do not know if there was only one officer in that police car or if he or she was operating under some regulation that made a driver more important than a passenger. It may have been that I was a small chick in a huge car and was therefore camouflaged against the seat. I just don't know. All I do know is that Kevin was gone, the cop was gone, and I was sitting in a running vehicle in the middle of the road. Yeah, I took off. In what I can only describe as a semi-fugue state, I drove Kevin's car back to the Radio Shack. After dropping off his car and getting mine, I drove to my boss's place, determined to get my fair share of pizza and beer in recompense for this fiasco of a night, and also to inform my boss that he would have to open the store tomorrow because Kevin was most likely not going to make it in on time. I was regaling everyone with the story of just why he wouldn't make it when the front door banged open and Kevin stumbled in. I'm not exaggerating when I say it was like one of those old Western saloon scenes. You know, the ones where the whole place quiets when the hero enters. Just like that, except instead of a hero gliding, it was Kevin flopping. He was soaking wet and disheveled, wild-eyed. He was completely out of breath and his shirt was missing. His exposed torso and arms were crisscrossed with deep scratches and abrasions. He looked like he'd been in a fight for his life. We all must have been staring at him in silent astonishment. I know that I was. Kevin squished into the room and collapsed wetly into a chair. In a garbled voice, he asked me if I had his car keys, and then, relieved with my answer, he motioned for a beer. Turns out that he did manage to successfully evade the cops that night. At the last moment, he found a drainage canal and jumped in. Fortunately, this saved him from arrest, but unfortunately, he wasn't alone in that canal. According to Kevin, an alligator chased him through a bunch of thorny brush, out of the water, and then up into a yard. He said he was terrified almost to death, but couldn't scream for help because his mouth was frozen from the dancing dust. He barely escaped with his life. Now, when it comes to this last part of the story, I don't know how much is actually true. However, I do know that I saw that man literally chow down on close to 4 grams of rocked up pure Peruvian marching powder before freaking swallowing it. Then, I saw that same dude evade the police by vanishing into the dark like some kind of overweight Hungarian Zorro, before reappearing triumphant and unscathed hours later. Based on this, I choose to believe him about the alligator. Either way, it was a night to remember. And that, my friends, is the stupid story of Kevin and the dancing dust. I'm sorry you read this. Jumping down to the comment section on this one, there's one from a user called I Miss Crazy Lenny. It says, "Oh, inventory nights at the shack. I was counting the crap in that gray cabinet behind the registers, kneeling on the floor, when my coworker walked over, sat on my back, and let loose a huge, smelly beer fart that vibrated down my spine." Okay, honestly, not sure why I read that comment, but I did. There's no taking it back now. This story is an interesting one to me. It actually really made me think. So we're talking back in the 90s, which means that there probably wasn't any kind of dash cam in the police car. But if you're pulling somebody over in a police car, generally one of the first things you would do would be to call in the license plate number from that car. So obviously in this case, that police officer didn't do this because otherwise they would have shown up at Kevin's work or house and would have found him and arrested him later. Another thing I don't understand is how Kevin didn't end up in the hospital. They said that he'd done a whole bunch of the dancing dust and then he put the rest of it in his mouth. Wouldn't that cause an OD? I guess I don't know enough about that stuff to really say for certain, but I'm sure some of you do, so let's see it in the comments down below. Would you think that would cause an OD? Cause that's kind of where my head's going. This next story comes to us from a wet Sasquatch. Kevin, the intern. Let's jump right in. My dear friends, it's roughly that time of year again for interns to descend on our departments, asking for things they have no business having, or asking things they should already know. I'm reminded of what may be the most socially oblivious intern I've ever come across. For context, I work for a large nationwide company, and my role is a Tier 2-3 IT support. I also take on a bit of security work and a bit of networking, kind of a jack of all trades. I'm also the only person in my position in my region of the country. Once a quarter, everyone on my team gives updates at an all-hands meeting, discussing the common issues that have been appearing in our regions and other metrics and things. These are big, important meetings that are attended by every level of IT management, up to and including the CIO. The CIO for our company is a very stoic kind of guy. He rarely cracks a joke, never uses anything other than very professional language, a skill picked up over a 45-year career. This will be important in a bit. This particular year, I had 21 interns starting in my immediate area of the country, so they were onboarding at my location. I don't really have a role in onboarding. Users are sent their equipment ahead of time, and they bring it in on their first day in case there's any issues that arose during imaging. 20 of these were for one program in particular, so they were off in their own space getting spun up and prepped for the project they'd be working on. There were a few issues with the interns' laptops that required my attention, so I was busy addressing them for most of the morning while I should have been prepping for the quarterly meeting. Enter Kevin. Kevin needed all kinds of hand-holding that he really should have called the help desk for, but they were swamped with other interns calling. I gave him the best support I could, but he kept trying to divert the conversation to literally anything other than the issues at hand. Now, I give a lot of grace to interns. They don't know anything, and they're here to learn. I get that, and I respect that. What I don't respect is when they don't seem like they care. The internship they got is highly competitive, so if they don't want to be there, it's a real bummer, because someone else absolutely would have. So Kevin starts talking about a book he wants to write. I'm trying to redirect him back to his computer at every turn, but he just doesn't get the hint, so it takes significantly longer than it should. At this point, I tell him I need to go present to this all-hands meeting, and I'll help him out when my part is done. I usually go early on and get it over with. I head back to my office and close the door. Because I have an office with a door, I'll usually close the door and have meetings on speaker. I get settled in and wait for my turn. Roughly 20 minutes later, I get to speak. In the middle of answering a question for the CIO, when Kevin barges into my office without knocking, and loudly asks me if I want to hear about the ideas he has for characters in the book he wants to write. There's a long period of silence, literally 7 or 8 seconds of me staring at this moron, not knowing how to react to what just happened. And through the speaker comes the inquisitive voice of our CIO. I'm sorry, what the F did he just ask? Friends, every single person on that call was laughing. I was too. I couldn't help it. And Kevin was laughing, though let's be real, he was probably laughing for a different reason. I told him I was in the middle of the meeting and sent him back to his desk. Miraculously, he wasn't fired for that, though I did notice he wasn't on the roster of interns for the next year. I hope you enjoyed my tale of Kevin and his first day of his internship. Jumping down to the comment section on this one, there's one from a user called Parlor Drolap. Okay. It says, bless him. He mistook your necessary attention for friendship, or tried to turn it into as much. Friend. So by the time he'd started talking to you about his book, you were firmly fixed as new best bud. His best bud totally wouldn't mind talking more about a fantastic idea he'd just had for his book. If your suspicion was that his laughter came from the place of assuming he was in some friend group sharing a big laugh, I also share that suspicion. Let's hope he found a place where he has an actual friend group where they can all talk about their book characters and things, preferably stopping them from interrupting important meetings or worse. even the ones that should have been an email. Ah yes, this kind of intern. This is the kind where you go to their desk and you'll find 2 books, and they haven't finished coloring the second one yet. The kind of intern that makes you wonder, just how the heck did you actually get this internship in the first place? Check out both OPs linked in the description down below. I thank you for watching. I hope you have a wonderful day, and we'll see you tomorrow.